What game is a good fit for your group? And how do you sell your players on that shiny new campaign you want to run? That's what this podcast is all about. We'll be sharing new tools for your gaming toolbox and discussing the most important issues a GM faces. My name is Bill.
My name is Colin.
And I'm Megan.
Our mission is to give you an overview of the whole process of running a successful game, from start to finale. But before you roll the dice, you have to convince your players to try your favorite game.
We'll also revisit our regular features on what's been going down at our own game table, inspiring stuff we've been reading or watching, and how to feed a group of hungry gamers. All this and more in Episode 2, The Pitch.
Batter up.
So, take a seat at the table.
Grab your dice.
Shake, rattle, and roleplay.
Return this week to our what will be a regular feature, Inspirations, where we each talk about something that gave us an idea for a game, or that we just liked, that we've interacted with over the last couple of weeks. So, Colin, I think you're going to tell us first about what was your inspiration.
Well, I've been playing BioShock Infinite over the last couple of weeks, and something that struck me from a gaming perspective about the game is that the character Elizabeth, who is a companion character to the player, is a great example of a character who, in a role-playing game, would be using maneuvers and blocks and things like that to aid another character who's, in fact, the attacking character. This is sort of a fate thing, but she's a great example as she does things like toss the main character ammunition, reloaded weapons. She will point out things that are going to be a problem soon, such as snipers or people with rocket launchers, that kind of thing. And these would be good examples of a character who's, playing the support role, a non-combat character who is aiding in combat by doing other things. So I thought that was interesting. And it's a really good game besides, so.
We'll look at you blankly because neither of us have played it yet.
Yes, well, I'm used to that at this point.
That's true. We don't play nearly as many video games as poor Colin.
So what about you, Bill?
My inspiration this week is the friendly local game store. Back over Easter, I got a chance to go back to our game store back in Kingston, which is the Kingston Gaming Nexus, run by my buddy Mike. It's probably the best game store I know. Mike always keeps a good selection of different games on his shelves, from popular stuff like Pathfinder or World of Darkness or Dungeons & Dragons or what have you, to interesting indie games. That's where I got my copy of Monster Hearts. And
yeah, he really has obscure stuff a lot of the time. It's great.
Yes. Yeah, it's always a place where you can go and be surprised. And he also has a shelf of used, older stuff. So if you've been looking for a game for a while, there's always a chance you might stumble on some little gem in that area. And it just kind of reinforced for me how important it is to have a good local game store that's kind of the center of your gaming community. I know here in London we have LA Mood that has always provided good support to our local game club at Western Warp. They're always contributing prizes, and they've always advertised our activities and that kind of things. So it just put me in mind of that.
So Megan, what about you?
This isn't so much an inspiration for a game, because I don't really have the flying fast game ideas that you and Bill do. But one of the best books I've read in the last couple of weeks is what's now a science fiction classic, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. And what I really like about Hyperion is the way it really is a collection of connected short stories. It's very much a Canterbury Tales sort of thing, where there's a bunch of people telling their stories on their way on a pilgrimage, and each story is this little gem of science fiction. There's not one of them that's not brilliant. Most of them are damned creepy, and it was just fantastic. And if anybody hasn't read Hyperion by Dan Simmons, which I had not up until about 2 weeks ago, I highly recommend you run out and get this book. It's one of the best books I've read in quite a while.
Okay, so this week we have
Hyperion by Dan Simmons.
And
the friendly local game store, and the Kingston Gaming Nexus in particular.
And BioShock Infinite.
So that wraps up Inspirations for this week, and next we'll move on to one of our main topics, which is the pitch.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about the pitch now. By this we mean a part of the game at the beginning where you are talking to your players about what kind of game you want to run. What's your idea for a campaign? So this is a bit of a chicken and egg situation with what our next topic is going to be after the next segment, which will be finding the right game system for your players, or for your game, rather. These two topics are obviously related, and there's a lot of interplay about them, but they are distinct topics, so we're going to take them separately. We're going to start with the pitch. Generally speaking, this is a GM-led topic, but definitely there's a lot of player involvement in it.
Right, and one of the core ideas is when you're trying to pitch a game, how do you communicate your vision?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this goes back to an idea from the screenwriting world, which is the elevator pitch. The idea being that if you were a young screenwriter trying to break in and you happen to be lucky enough to be in an elevator for 30 seconds with an influential studio executive, how do you quickly communicate your brilliant idea to him and sell that movie? So it's the same philosophy, but with your gaming group. What you want to do is come up with a clear, concise way of expressing what you have in mind to your group in a way that's going to get them excited and get them on board to play that game. And I think the really crucial part of a pitch to your group is communicating the right tone to your group to let them know what kind of game you have in mind, because obviously if you're playing a lot of games that are in established systems or settings, people may have a lot of different ideas about what that game could be. If I tell you that we're playing a superhero game, that might mean to you that we're playing something like the Super Friends, or it could mean the Watchmen, so there's a lot of range there, and what you want to make sure is that everybody is on the same page going in so that you know what kind of game you're going to get.
And that this can solve a lot of problems later on, because if you come into a game with a bunch of different ideas about which way you're going, the game can end up being discordant.
Right, well, we had this happen in in a superhero game that Bill ran at one point, Chronicles of the Dusk Millennium. We just ended up with characters from entirely different universes. I mean, I was playing a gritty mobster's daughter who turned criminal psychiatrist, who was very, dark and, wasn't that pleasant. And Colin was playing a big blue fuzzy troll.
And I was doing a sort of Perfect Strangers thing with another character where we were sort of incongruous roommates.
You were my roommate for a while. You kept eating my sofa.
Yes, and then you pawned me off on another player. And
yes,
then,
thank God.
Yes.
And then we had another character who was playing, the most over-the-top superhero possible, who was
sort of
always talking in a big booming voice about how he was the best.
He was a Captain Hammer type.
Yeah, exactly. He was playing Captain Hammer.
Yeah, and then we had an eco-terrorist. And so we just had 4 characters that in no way occupied the same imaginary space. Mm-hmm. And we had some fun with it for a while, but it really became a problem that we could not find a tone that settled it for all of us.
And that all goes back to me. I mean, that's on my shoulders, that I did not communicate a strong vision of what the world was going to be like and what the game was going to be going into it. So what we ended up with at the table was basically 4 games, each of which could have been fun and entertaining on their own, but altogether they just created this wall of crazy noise, and eventually we had to walk away from that game.
Oh, well, I will say that I do think I at least had fun playing and watching each one of those segments, but it did become a problem anytime we were supposed to be working together.
Yeah, we were not a good team at all. I kept wanting to punch Captain Hammer into next week. Or Captain Hammer equivalent. He wasn't actually Captain Hammer.
Mm-hmm. Whereas I would eat things.
Yeah, you ate everything. Most of my
only
possessions.
Only minerals.
Yeah, that was a lot of my furniture.
Well, you should have had more food in your apartment.
And appliances.
You should have had more expensive electronics in your apartment.
Huh. So there are games where this just doesn't work, and superheroes is one of those genres that can go from very gritty to very light, and that you really need to be aware that you've communicated to your players, like, this is what we are playing. Mm-hmm. So Bill has come up with an innovative way to try to get that across to players that I think works really well if you have the writing skills he does. So Bill's going to tell us about the campaign trailers he's been writing recently.
Yeah, I've posted these on my blog, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes and on our Facebook page so you can check them out. But the basic idea is that I wrote up trailers for campaigns that I was proposing to the group as though they were summer movie trailers. So you get little clips of a proposed movie that kind of gives you the flavor of what that story is going to be like. So it's, in 2 or 3 pages, you kind of get the whole feel for the game without necessarily telling the whole story.
And in practice, you actually have us read those at the table to each other, assign characters, and we'll read it out with all the stage directions, and it's a good way to kind of really get people interested fast.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, these are often tone-setting things. They often don't include PCs, although they sometimes do if it's a sequel, but the idea being to set a clear tone of what this type of game is going to be about.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I think it's worked both ways. I mean, one time you gave us those game trailers about people we wouldn't actually be playing. They were, you're proposals for 4 games we could play in these trailers and had no real connection to the characters we would be playing. And then
Sure, and often at this stage in creating your game, you're not going to know who the player characters are, so you kind of have to come up with types that sort of fill those roles and give you a sense of what kind of characters are going to flourish in this world.
yeah, and those both made us enthusiastic and kind of let us know what you wanted. And then you just this last week you posted 2 that were sequels to games we'd already played, and so we already knew those characters, but it pretty much made most of our group go like ballistic with enthusiasm just had to play those games. Almost literally.
That's nice to hear.
Speaking of doing multiple pitches for multiple trailers, do you have a sense of how many games it might be wise or to pitch at once, or maybe what is too many?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. The first time I tried this was, I think, last spring, and I had a whole bunch of different ideas for games in a bunch of different genres and stuff, and I pitched, I think, 4 or 5 of them at the same time, and we found that was kind of too overwhelming. It was sort of very hard to sort of have a focused conversation on what we were going to do, where we were going to go from there, because it sort of felt like I didn't have a focus, so we had a lottery kind of thing to see which one we were going to go with.
Multiple rounds of voting.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think your attention was too scattered too, because we all ended up picking one that we were all very enthusiastic about, and then it never actually ran.
Yeah.
Which would suggest that, again, you weren't really that enthused about it to begin with, maybe.
Well, I don't think it was that. I had been running into some creative problems, and I think I just wasn't ready for that particular game. And it's still sort of simmering on the back burner, but I find that with game ideas, sometimes they need a little time to cook, if you will.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, so the question is, do you want to give your players choice? And sometimes that may be a good thing, or do you want to go, this is the game I want to run, here's a trailer?
Well, I've noticed in the past couple of times we've done this where a choice has been presented. 2 seems to be about right. We had our friend Amanda had suggested 2 games last time she did a pitch, and we sort of we talked about both of them. They were both fairly focused conversations, but that ended up working. I did the same thing when I pitched Deadlands to you guys. I said, well, I can do one on PTA, and here is the one idea, or we can do something a bit more adventure-y on Fate. Here is that idea.
But that's a little bit different in that you're giving us 2 different ways to play the same game, as opposed to these are 4 different games you could play. And I think that's actually a good way to do it.
Right. Well, it's 2 different explorations of similar concepts.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think maybe that more focused. If the GM is really enthusiastic about a game, a specific game, and really, really wants to run it, I would prefer that over him going, I kind of want to run these 4, but I'm not quite as enthusiastic about any of them.
Yeah, I think it's a way better idea to sort of, maybe pick a genre or pick a game system that you want to kick around, and we'll get to that in the next segment, but to sort of focus your attention and go, this is what I feel most passionate about right now. What do you guys think we could do with this? What direction going forward is going to be best for us?
Yeah, and the trailers work wonderfully for you because you're really good at writing them, and I really love reading them. Colin and I do not exactly have your skill with the written word.
And I'm actually far too detail-oriented, such that I cannot put a trailer together. I've tried doing written dialogue before, and it just does not work for me.
Yeah, and I managed to do a script for the first part of the one game I ran, but not as a trailer.
There's also time constraints.
Absolutely. So what do you do if you're, don't have Bill's skill with words? And Colin and I think both have generally tend to go the way of collective creation, which will actually be 1 or 2 episodes coming up talking about collective campaign creation, where we both came with something that was very simple. In my first game I ran, it was Jazz Age Chicago with Faye.
Right.
And in the game
and then later we would take that concept and build on it.
Yeah.
But yes,
that was the basic. And yours was for the core.
Post-apocalyptic Toronto and fog.
And vaguely Buffyverse.
Yes, as cosmology.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we would build on it from there. But those were groundwork for the pitch, and then we would build up from there.
And through the collective creation, through the collaboration, we kind of went, okay, this is going to be the tone we're going for, because we did it with the groups, and so we didn't have as much of that clash of tone or expectations what the quote tone was going to be. It's more just making sure those expectations are all on the same page. And there are a couple of different ways to do it, but make sure you communicate that to people.
Well, going on from that, but in a similar vein, what do you guys think about established campaign setting? Things like Forgotten Realms, things like Deadlands, things like Exalted.
I think it's really all about telling your players, or asking your players maybe, where you're going to focus the camp. Because if you've got a canvas that big, it could mean a lot of different things. If you're playing a Forgotten Realms game, you can have a totally different game set in that setting if it's set in Waterdeep or in the Dale Lands, or, you could be in the jungle somewhere or up in the frozen north fighting frost giants, or doing, a gritty city campaign where you're all, thieves and assassins in Westgate or whatever. It's really about figuring out where it's going to take place.
And if you're not married to the idea of using the original game mechanics that came with that setting, and this is going to kind of bleed over into the next part of the conversation, but what system you use to run it can actually help, again, set that tone. When you were Deadlands game you're running right now, when you were proposing it to us, essentially the system was an essential part of what that game could be and what the tone would be like.
Yes, and either of the game systems I proposed were Deadlands or had ever run Deadlands.
Right.
Right.
So those very much have a lot to do with setting tone.
So how do we find focus within those game worlds? Is there anything that needs to be communicated?
Exactly where they're going to be set, finding out what things people want to do. Do they want to be out robbing? Do they want to be, the gunslingers in the West? Are they sheriffs of a town?
Some things are always going to be a better fit for your players, and a lot of this is sort of figuring out what they're going to enjoy the most and aiming your pitch at them. They're your audience and your collaborators, so it's got to be something that gets them excited.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the better you know your players, the more you can tailor your pitch to really, get people on board.
Mm-hmm. I believe when I pitched Deadlands to you guys on PTA, the pitch was this game takes place in a single city, in Dodge City. It is about the railroad reaching that city and the implications of that and exploration of that, and that it wouldn't be spaghetti western, it wouldn't be, groups of gunfighters running around. This would be perhaps a bit more serious, much more character-driven, much more personal stories.
Right, and going with PTA made that almost inevitable. So I guess that kind of bleeds over into our next topic, so let's take a break and then maybe come back to that after we have discussed what's been going on at our table recently.
Lock your keys in the house next door and attach your favorite things to the bathroom floor. And as you're waiting for the sink to...
So next we're going to talk about some stuff that's going down at our table, or more accurately at Megan's table, since this is a game that I'm not actually playing in. I just get to hear about what happens and occasionally whisper ideas in her ear and push her in a certain direction.
He's my co-conspirator.
That's right. So, Colin, what's been going down after the ball?
Just to give a little bit of context, enough to help you understand, After the Ball is a game set in Gilded Age New York, but much more steampunky. There's elements of supernatural there. And the game is exploring some relationships between some people, ethical implications of certain types of technology, and things such as that.
And everyone has father issues.
Everybody has father issues. Another example of unintended game themes.
Yeah, it's weird. Everybody came up with father issues.
Mm-hmm. But we had a moment this past week where one of these characters was interacting with her father, and that character has always been fairly flippant, fairly dismissive of her father. She has a very bad relationship with him, blames him for putting their mother in an asylum.
Which he did do.
Which he did. But in this moment, you were looking to push past that a little bit, to provoke a different reaction, maybe force her to respond to the father character in a way that character had not. The two of them were having a dialogue in his office, and the character was being flippant in response to what he was saying, and what did you do?
I yelled at her.
Okay.
I went, "God damn it, Tess."
And more.
Yeah, and then really went after her.
And there's our explicit tag.
Right. So, yeah, it was this moment where so far Tess had only interacted with her father in the flippant mode, and we'd had an entire other scene the week before that where she'd been very flippant the whole way, and I was trying attack, and I think I sort of got to her a little bit, but she was still treating me exactly the same way, and it was, while I was in the middle of that scene, I'm like, I have to do something, I have to shake this up to push that player into kind of a deeper reaction than just blowing him off. Mm-hmm. Even if she doesn't agree with him, I need to get through to her. And so I yelled at her quite loudly and then just went after her for several lines, like just going, I trusted you, I told you this, and just everything she had, just hammering her really hard. And that was a really good scene from that point on. Mm-hmm. Before that, it was just a retread of what we'd done before. And I think I don't know how it looked, but it just felt like it went really interesting places from there.
Well, the room, we've got a room full of new players, or new to this type of play, I should say. And there was a little bit of initial uncomfortableness, a little bit of nervous giggling at first, but the room committed after that point, and the player committed, and it did become a very good scene after that.
Yeah, so it was just seemed to be a useful technique, that kind of on the fly, looking at someone and going, okay, they're doing exactly the same thing they've done every time they're in. We need to shake this up, or this is always going to be the same scene, her and her dad. And her being flippant. And this would happen in a lot of circumstances where people are stuck on one groove of the record, and you just need to jolt them out of them. And yelling at her was remarkably effective because it changed the entire dynamic of that relationship.
And just to be clear, it's not like there was a problem with her being flippant in all the previous scenes.
It was perfectly valid. It was just like I felt that had gone on long enough, and I needed to provoke some change as the GM. I needed to push her.
A response that was not the response that had been given before.
Absolutely. And then this is something I think I've stolen from Bill. I think I've seen you do this to players at the table, where you take a tack in the moment that is utterly different to provoke a very different reaction and make us think about what we're doing.
Yes, I do.
Yes, you do. But Bill's actually the classic of like banging on the table all of a sudden to get your attention. If somebody's supposed to be scared, it's great.
Yeah, horror is kind of a hallmark thing in my style. I always have scary scenes in my games, and one of the ways that I have found to shake up players and startle them is to actually make a physical loud noise by banging on the table or something like that. I've sometimes made people uncomfortable by standing up and pacing around the table so that my voice was coming from different places. Anything to kind of get people, like you say, uneased.
Yeah, I mean, and the banging the table thing, you jump like a foot every time he does it. It's great.
It's really good, and I've totally stolen it and used it against you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So just that idea that sometimes I wanted to bring that up as a topic just because it was one of those moments where I was very pleased that I was noticing that we were just doing the same scene again, and I wanted it to be somehow different and on the fly going, okay, this is how I can push her. So, yell at your players every once in a while.
That's one thing that I think is a really important part of the GM's job, and it is kind of one of those fine-tuning kind of skills that you learn over the process of years, is just to kind of be paying attention to the scenes as they play out, and to be able to say to yourself, we need something here, and to decide what that is sort of on the fly and toss some new ingredient into the mix, see what you can get simmering and boiling in the scene is really valuable and important part of being a GM.
Cool.
I agree.
There's a fire that's fueling in the workplace as it describes an old friend's fall from grace. You can't just go, get up and leave. My hands remain ingrained in your history. Avoiding plans to go for coffee with the skyline.
So now we're going to talk a little bit more about getting ready to start to run your game, and it's about finding the right system for your players and for yourself. I mean, how do you balance the sort of things your players want versus what you want? What are our thoughts? Colin wants to be a chicken, apparently.
Yes, that is what I meant.
He was making...
I was going to say that...
It's a complex dance, finding the right system. Is that correct?
That is correct. Like the chicken dance, it is a complex dance, finding the right system for your game. No, it is definitely the case that this is the chicken to the previous segment's egg, where this discussion goes hand in hand with the pitch.
Our egg to the previous system's chicken.
Who is to say?
Let's not beat this metaphor any further.
Aw.
I think we could probably scramble it a bit,
right,
if you like.
So, I mean, what we're talking about is, first of all, what do you need as a GM, right? Like, you have to run a system that you are comfortable with, full stop.
Yeah.
Right.
Not only the GM comfort level, but the player comfort level as well. I have lots of games on my shelf that I love well that my players would never accept at the table. They will never get run in their native systems because that's just not going to work.
Right. But yeah, I mean, for the GM needs, I mean, I have a very narrow band of what I run. I run so far one game. Well, I guess I ran something at a con once. That was
you have run 2 game systems.
I've run 2 game systems. I've run 3. I've run Fiasco, in that anyone ever runs Fiasco, which they do not.
You facilitated Fiasco.
So yeah, I mean, I run PTA. I pretty much just run PTA. And I love it. I love it as a system, and we're going to talk about it more in a minute. But
So, from a GM comfort level side, why does PTA work for you?
Because it has the fewest rules possible.
Okay.
It facilitates the type of play I like, which, again, we'll talk about in a second.
Okay.
So what kind of things are you looking for, Colin, when you're...
Well, I strive to tell stories about characters. It's still something that I'm trying to break free of gamer baggage from, that I always tend to turn to game systems to do that. But I'm finding over the course of my GMing career that I'm going more and more system light, and that has arrived me now at Primetime Adventures. It is partially that I like Primetime Adventures. It's partially that there are things in other game systems that I sometimes find frustrations with. I find it very frustrating when I have to break the progress of the game or break immersion in order to explain to a player how to do something. So anytime I have to stop and go, okay, well, here's how you make your attack roll, here's how blocks work, here's how this particular mechanic works in this game system, I find having those moments where I have to stop the game to do that are very frustrating to me.
Oh boy, grappling rules.
Grappling rules are a great example of that, but I mean, this can happen in any game system.
Yeah, that's right.
So having a game system where there is only one mechanic for everything is very nice, because it means I never run into those situations. Also, I mean, it sort of cuts the support harness off of you in a sense, which I think is useful to me, because my biggest problems as a GM are technique-based, and so not having the game system holding me up in that way so that I can just, I don't know what to do, I'm going to run a 20-minute combat while I think about it, means that I can't do that anymore.
What about you, Glenn?
For me, I want a system that is light enough that I can spend the majority of my time thinking about what the players are doing and thinking about how I can best tell my story. I think it was a big revelation for me a few years ago when I started to run Cinematic Unit System, because in that system, the GM doesn't do any rolling at the table. So I was put in the position for the very first time of when I sat down to run a game, all I did was listen to what my players were telling me they wanted and what they wanted to do. And that really changed my relationship with players at the table. And I think that my games got 100% better after that.
Right. And then, of course, as you said, you have to gear your games to your players. Like, for instance, you guys both know that if you bring in something with too much crunch, it's not that I can't do it, it's that I don't enjoy doing it, and I get cranky.
Well, also, you tend to interact with those systems by picking something, and that's how you interact with the game system.
Yes.
You learn how to make an attack roll, and then you do nothing but make attack rolls,
Yeah.
as much as possible.
Yeah, pretty much.
I think there's also something to the idea that you pick the kind of system that supports the kind of game that you are trying to run. So the game that you have pitched to your players. If you're trying to run a game that concentrates more on horror, let's say, there's some kinds of games that are not going to work for that. Toon is not going to work for a horror game, I would bet.
Not with that attitude.
A game like Pathfinder, let's say, that concentrates on a lot of combat, maybe there is not going to be enough support for the kinds of behaviors that you want in a horror game or a drama game either.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, it's the sort of thing with D&D and Pathfinder. It's not that you can't role play in them. You certainly can. You can do heavy character stuff. It's just the system itself does not specifically support that. You would have to add that on as something entirely different. What the system supports is combat.
And the conflicts that the game system does in that and many other role-playing games is simply, can you beat this challenge?
Right.
You cannot set stakes like, can I make this person respect me more?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not that you can't do, say, the role play in those games. It's just it's going to have to be something you're going to have to bring it all to the table in.
Yeah, I think the people that say system matters are exactly right in that system, it conditions players to what kinds of behaviors are expected of them and what they are able to do according to the rules. You know, that plays a big part in what kinds of things players attempt and focus on in a game.
Absolutely. If it's something that's really gritty, they're not going to try to do the really outrageous stuff, whereas stuff that encourages, flights of fancy and awesome description will support it.
Right.
And yeah, you can certainly pull these things into different systems. You can bend and break systems to some degree, but definitely systems support certain types of play.
There's also a sheer matter of time spent on activities. If you are going to play a system that heavily supports combat, or even moderately supports combat, you're probably talking about a combat that is 20 to 40 minutes. Even in Fate, which is fairly light, you're still at least talking about a 10-minute sequence, which is fine. But, how much time do you want to spend on these topics, right? If you want to have a 40-minute combat and positioning is important and that kind of thing, and that's the fun, great, you should pick a system for that. But if combat bores you, or you're interested in combat only insofar as what the cost is to your group, how injured you get, and whether or not anything interesting comes out of that, then that's not the right thing for you. You need to pick something lighter.
I have to say that I hear on a lot of different podcasts and from a lot of different role players that I run into that combat is a common complaint with them, that it just slows things down so much. There's so much effort and time at the table being spent on combats that maybe even aren't even that important. And it sort of feels like, we're investing all this time that is keeping us from getting to the next bit that people are interested in. And, I guess the question ultimately becomes, why are we putting all this effort into something that we're not enjoying at all?
Yeah, and do you fight the system or do you just go to another system? Like, you're never going to play a Pathfinder Pathfinder game where there's no combat, right? Like
that would be a weird Pathfinder.
That would be a weird Pathfinder game.
That would be a surely perverse Pathfinder game, I think.
Yeah. So would you then go to another system?
Although we did do a 3.5 game where the majority of the game was spent doing a culinary tour.
Yes, it was our culinary tour of Eberron.
Yes.
One place they boiled their dinosaur meat. Don't go there.
Oh.
That's horrific. Such a waste of good meat. So one other thing that can be a consideration with players is that some players really need more structure in their lives. I've run into players with this who are new to role-playing, at least new to storytelling-focused games, especially, or people who have other difficulties or whatever. But some players need more structure in order to enforce certain types of behaviors, such as pursuing character goals.
Yeah, and the new player thing is actually really important. I mean, if you sit someone down who's never role-played before and say, you can do anything you want, that may not be that helpful. They'll be like, what? So in that case, more structure might be a good thing.
Right, you end up with the decision paralysis, and you may end up with sort of a zany response or whatever that is discordant with the themes you're trying to set up with the game.
I think it's interesting to note that you run into a couple of streams of problems there, right? You run into the new player problem where they do not know what behavior is expected of them. And you run into the gamer baggage problem where if someone has played a particular kind of game for a long period of time, then role-playing becomes one thing to them, right? They expect that kind of structure and that for their choices to be more prescribed because that is what they are used to.
Exactly so. That is not to say that, more system is better for everybody. That is just to say that, some people can really benefit from it. And in the end, this could be a gateway to something that is different than what they're doing.
Yeah, in any case, know your players.
Absolutely.
I know at least one player, and probably a handful actually, that find the lighter story games or indie games, whatever euphemism you want to use, a little bit too mushy, if you want, for their liking. They can't really grapple with systems that don't narrow down the mechanics to at least like a few prescribed behaviors.
Mm-hmm. I can definitely understand how somebody might have difficulty with that. And certainly it's taken some getting used to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're going to talk about, just to end off this section, a few of our favorite games and what sorts of role-playing we think they particularly facilitate. Why these are good things to play if you're trying to do that kind of heavy character, heavy drama play.
Although you may have already guessed what some of our favorite game systems are as is.
So, yeah. So no one will be surprised if we say Primetime Adventures is one of those games.
Right. But why do we like PTA?
I love PTA. Helen, why do you love PTA?
I really like PTA because of the way that conflicts are set up. Both in that you can create a conflict around anything and cut to the matter immediately, rather than in some other game systems you must dance around the topic in order to try to get to the issue that you're trying to get to. So if the issue is, I want this person to respect me more, I want this person to be attracted to me, I want to shoot this guy in the head, right? That's the conflict. You don't go building up to that through the course of building up stress or dealing damage or whatever and hope that you get there. You just cut to it, which I really like. Yeah. But one of the things I really like.
What about you, Bill?
Oh, I like PTA because it has large, soulful eyes, and it's always very gentle and... wait a minute.
No, you're right. Go on.
No, that's Judd Nelson.
Wait.
No, Megan, go ahead.
I'm pretty sure you're right.
Judd Nelson what now? As I've said, PTA is pretty much all I've run, and I love it for A, its lack of crunch, but B, that the mechanics really are there to supplement character play. It is not, and we will say this now, it is not the system you want to go to if you want combat to be the conflict, because combat is going to be resolved in one hand of cards, and it's not going to be protracted. Our friend Rob ran into this when he ran the supervillain game we played at one point, where at one point he really wanted us to have this really difficult fight, and darned if I didn't pull the exact hand I needed to take them down in one hit.
But conversely, it can be a great system if you want to deal with the outcomes of combat.
Absolutely.
And have those be meaningful.
Absolutely, and that's where it's really good with conflict, is it's designed to make failing a conflict, not getting what you want, as interesting as possible. It is a game where that's probably going to happen maybe half the time. You're not going to get what you want, and yet the system supports that being a good thing. The system supports interesting complications that you, the player, may actually create yourself, depending on who wins narrative control, and that sharing of narrative control really throws things up in the air.
Mm-hmm. And pushes the game and the characters' arcs in directions that are interesting and often unusual.
Yeah, but it's very hard to run combat for. When I ran around midnight, I think I had one combat sequence maybe in that whole game. Mm-hmm. And I certainly haven't had really any in After the Ball.
I think the thing to do with that game system is not think about it as running a combat. The thing to do is think about it as running a physical conflict.
Right.
This person is trying to shoot this other person.
Right, and outcomes can be, brutal. I mean, you're not talking about hit points, but take your Deadlands game this week. I was trying to get away from someone, and I failed, and I ended up with the crap beaten out of me. right? And then tied up in somebody's basement. And that was interesting. It was a good thing. I was perfectly happy to lose that conflict because it was an interesting answer, but I got way more beaten up than you would probably see in a combat-focused game.
And running the same sequence in another game system, even something comparatively light like Fate, probably would have taken 4 or 5 rounds to do.
Absolutely.
And even then, maybe we would have gotten to that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we got right to the heart of that right away. You know, we had a good character scene up to that, and then we had the conflict, which was, do I escape or does she beat the crap out of me?
Yes, and that worked pretty nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are disadvantages with PTA. It does require the player to differentiate between what the player wants and what the character wants. That can sometimes be a thing, and has been a thing when the character clearly wants to kill this other person, but you maybe can't ask for that as a stake because they're another PC and we don't want to put them out of the game. But by and large, pretty happy with it.
Yeah, and again, you may not get what you want a lot of the time, and if that's really important that you get what you want all the time, PTA may be a little bit difficult. But it makes it interesting and it makes it worthwhile.
I think really most of the time players want what they want every time. It's because they've been in many situations where they've been punished for not getting what they
They've been
want.
screwed by the GM for...
Yeah. Well, our other favorite system, our other go-to system for things, especially when we want something that's a little bit more rough and tumble, a little bit more action-oriented, even if that action is going to be gritty or even if it's going to be pulpy, would be...
Fate.
And so, Bill, tell us
Hooray!
about Fate. Does Fate also have dreamy eyes?
Fate does have dreamy eyes. Well, big soulful eyes and purple hair sometimes.
Should I be
In the
jealous
case
if you're
of Fred Hicks.
taking your gaming books to bed these days? It's something I'm worried about.
You leave them alone. No, I think the thing that makes Fate a really strong game is that it enables you to create narrative-heavy games through the use of things like aspects. I think aspects are probably my favorite gaming innovation of the past 10 years, and the reason for that is because they are flexible and they are subjective. If you have a character's aspects, they are uniquely meaningful to the player that created them, and they can mean different things.
So these are, for people who don't know Fate, you may all, but aspects are kind of one-line descriptions of something that's very important about your character that you'll be able to draw on mechanically during play.
Yes, an important person, place, thing, or feeling, something important.
And these
about a character or scene.
And these often differ from things like weaknesses, flaws, strengths, merits, that kind of thing. It's different from those things in that you don't decide ahead of time what those things mean mechanically. You can decide on the fly to try to fit them into a situation.
They're very flexible, which is
right.
nice.
Yeah, makes them far more robust.
You can do something as pedestrian as make it important that the scene is played out in darkness, or you can do something as large as saying that certain ideas are important to this campaign. So if I'm playing a high-adventure game like Sherwood, my Rocket Robin Hood game, I can make swashbuckling action an aspect that anyone can tag at any time to hype up their buckling of swashes.
Or
Swashing of bucklers.
or you-
whatever idiom you want.
or you can try to encourage behavior with them. For example, in your game, and really just generally, I love to play characters that get beaten up a lot and are injured constantly.
Oh.
And so I've built a aspect for my character that is specifically there so that Bill can use it all the time to hurt me.
Which one is that?
The masochist aspect.
Big?
Yeah, it's simultaneously that, I can probably dish out a lot of damage, but I'm a big target. I'm easy to hit, so I always can just take a beating.
You're Little John.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but don't let the name fool you. In real life, he's very big.
I can punch him?
Yes.
Okay.
And he does
Very
get punched frequently.
Okay, so what do you love about Fate, Colin?
Well, like I just said, I think there's a tremendous ability to shape behavior on the part of both the GMs and the players, which I quite like. One of my favorite things about it is that rather than dealing with something like hit points when you are taking damage, you deal with consequences, which means that when your character gets beaten up, you don't just have a number that's like 48 out of 96 on your character sheet, you have broken ribs. And that is immediately much more interesting, because it means that conflicts can give shape to things that come afterwards.
Right, because consequences are just another kind of aspect.
Right, and they can follow you around, and they inform your role-playing in a way that hit points can inform your role-playing, but not in the same way.
This taps into something visceral much more quickly.
I think so. That's something I really love about the game system. But I also always like my characters to get beaten up, so that's important to me.
I think the other thing that at our table has been a lot of fun with Fate is that we have found that it is a game that enables players to choose characters that are maybe not combat focused,
Yes.
that can still be useful and find themselves doing entertaining things if a combat scene breaks out.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time I only played combat monsters, A, because I like to, but B, because they seem to have the most fun in game. games that once the combat started, they were the most effective, and why would I play anything else?
Well, in any other game system, I mean, if you're not a combat-focused character, you are now exempted from 40 minutes of content.
Yeah, absolutely. And Fate was really one of the first games that I played where I'm like, okay, I can do something that is not combat-focused, and I can do something that is mechanically helpful enough that it's worth my while to run around setting up traps or distracting a guy, because I can put a maneuver on them, and Bill, who was playing our big combat character in that particular game that I'm thinking of, he could use it for a very substantial bonus. And so it was always worth my while to be thinking outside the box and not combat-focused, and I still got to have lots of fun in combat, and that had almost never happened before.
I also think that type of behavior of creating maneuvers and doing blocks and things like that is also interesting to think about ahead of time how you're going to do it, because it's a much more complex question than I stab the guy with my sword.
Yeah.
Right? Now, of course, you can describe combat in a lot of interesting ways, and you totally should, but trying to do maneuvers is often a bit tricky, and that makes it interesting.
Yeah, and it's just one of those cases where the rules really shape how you can play, right? Just rules shape expectations. And because these rules support non-combat characters in combat, suddenly all the options are much more open.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we love Fate.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we love Fate.
And also PTA.
Yeah. And those are two systems that we want to talk about because they're very broad and they can be adapted to just about anything, PTA and Fate. But we also wanted to mention a couple of games that give a very focused experience that we thought, that we've really enjoyed recently, that do very specific things and do them very well. So the first one was Monster Hearts, which I ran at a con a little while ago, and that's the one where everyone is in high school and full of angst and also a monster.
And we played that particular game with some new players, people who were either new to story-type games, or one person who was completely new to role-playing.
Yeah, and it was really fun. It really did that. It gave the angsty teen monster experience came directly to life. The system entirely supported it.
Yeah, the thing I found most interesting about that is that I think although we are all kind of old hands at playing role-playing games that are focused on drama, that we don't necessarily expect that out of new players that we get into a game with. And in this case, we got into a game where fairly quickly we were playing some very high-stakes scenes with material that I think would make a lot of role players maybe uneasy to play in a game.
With lots and lots of sex.
With lots and lots of sex, yes.
Well, intimacy and that type of role-playing can be scary for new players.
Yeah.
Or even
right.
experienced players.
That's right, but I think that Monster Hearts frames that experience so well that it puts you in a place where you feel like that's a comfortable thing to deal with, or at least an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
And there are incentives to do it.
That is right.
I completely agree.
And the other one was, we've played a lot of Fiasco whenever we just need a game every once in a while, and Fiasco, again, is fairly focused towards everything is going to go wrong, everyone's a little bit petty, and people are going to die, and shit is going to go down.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a general truth of what you might call an indie game or a story game, and there are a fair amount of them on the market these days, is that they tend to focus on the singular experience instead of the broad experience. So oftentimes you're going to run into a story game that it may not be useful to use it for playing your wuxia martial arts epic and your science fiction galaxy-spanning game, but it may tell one very, very focused, specific kind of game extremely well, and only that. But I think that's enough, and it's instructive to sort of play those very focused experiences, kind of teach you what role-playing games can do, and to have your players kick the tires on different kinds of styles and see what they like.
Yeah.
Because a lot of players we know in our experience have not had a lot of opportunities to try these different kinds of things, and are indeed very excited to see what other things role-playing games can do when they get the chance.
Yeah, and Fiasco's really good. If you're trying to ease players into the idea that failing is not always a bad thing, sometimes bad things happen to their characters, that can be really interesting. Fiasco is the game, right? Because bad things are going to happen, and it's so much fun.
Yeah, it is almost a game about failure, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Spectacular failure.
Most of the time, everyone's miserable or dead. Maybe, once in a while, someone gets a good ending, but not often. So it's a good way to introduce people to the idea that, being happy all the time and getting exactly what you want, there's other things to go for sometimes.
Yeah, the spectacular fail can be a lot of fun, which is what I've been trying to tell you guys for years now.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to play Dread some time ago, and I thought that they did a fantastic job of creating a suspenseful situation with a group of players who had not played together in a horror situation. This is a game where you have a Jenga tower on the table, and anytime the Jenga tower falls over, that character who was in the process of pulling the block or just moved the table, that character dies. And so this does a great job of creating a horror scenario as well as creating a lot of tension. And I saw behavior behavior on the parts of the players where people were starting to back away slowly from the table as the course of the game went on, because nobody wanted to be the dude who knocked it over by accident. And
This is a game where mechanically the rules are creating suspense.
Right, exactly so. And this is interesting in that suspense really effectively transfers to the players and then gets back into the game. So the game mechanics make the players nervous, and because the player is nervous, it's much easier to hook into what the characters are going through, and was a really cool experience.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I think that about wraps us up on finding the right system. So as we said, know your players, know yourself, and look at what the system supports, what kind of play it encourages.
All right, and then we'll wrap up this episode with Breaking Bread.
When you're on a mountain with faces in the sea, they're on to something, wallowing beneath a tiny longing.
So, this week on Breaking Bread, our segment about feeding hungry gamers, we're going to talk about probably the most classic of gamer foods, the pizza.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy.
Now, you could order pizza in, but man, there are other options.
Right. Foundations are important, like we talked about in the last episode, and the same is true with pizza. So we're going to start with getting crust.
Right. So, there are a couple of different ways. I mean, making a yeasted crust yourself is tasty, but can be a pain in the ass.
Right. So, assuming that you don't have the time to do that, there are other options available. You can go to most any bakery, or perhaps your grocery store, and buy a pre-made dough. These are usually for making bread, but they work, well, bread dough and pizza dough are not that different. There's technically some differences, but for our purposes, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, so if you want the yeasted dough, you can buy it instead of doing it yourself.
Right, so you just roll it out and go from there.
Yeah.
There's another option, though. There's lots of different types of crust, and one of the easiest ones to do is a St. Louis-style crust, which is a cracker-like crust that's very thin, and instead of being yeasted, it's made with baking powder. You can just Google this concept, get a crust online. Super simple. This will take you like 10 minutes to put together. It's less complicated than making biscuits.
Yeah, it's pretty much the only way I make pizza these days. I like yeasted crusts, but if I'm doing it at home, St. Louis crust is the way to go.
Right, so this very thin, cracker-like, crisp, very pleasant. Your quintessential thin crust pizza.
So moving on from the crust, we get to sauce.
Right. Myself, I often don't put sauce on pizza when I'm at home.
That's because you're a bad person.
Well,
Hey.
I find that the caramelization of the cheese is more important to me, and the sauce interferes with that. And I don't really find the tomato sauce adds that much for
I
me.
don't like sauce that much either.
Well, then you're both bad people.
Okay, so
You should feel bad.
So why don't you give us the case for sauce? For tomato sauce specifically.
Sauce needs no defense because it is awesome on its own.
Okay.
It is an absolute good.
Okay.
Oh, it is not.
Well, I will say that I like pesto sauces on my pizza, in part because I'm going to put oil on my pizza anyway, and so why not add a bit of extra flavor? I'm also a sucker for anything with basil in it, so basil pesto is very nice. Key with sauce, regardless, don't use too much. If it's tomato sauce or if it's pesto sauce, which is a very different thing, but just don't use too much. If you use too much, your pizza will never crisp up the way you want it to, and it may make it soggy.
And since Bill and I have the ongoing tomato sauce, discussion, when I make pizza at home, I often go for something called a grandma pizza, where you skip sauce, but you take a can of diced tomatoes, drain the sauce out of them, and sprinkle them on top of the pizza. So you still get some of the tomato flavor, but it's less heavy than the sauce, and it's less pervasive.
And
That's okay, I guess.
the tomato flavor is actually often brighter than it would be in a sauce situation because the tomatoes aren't as cooked
Right.
as they would be with the canned tomato sauce.
Yeah, and I certainly like it a lot better than sauce.
And it doesn't interfere with the cheese caramelization, so really, there's no downside here.
So, Bill, you're just wrong. So what about toppings? Colin, you have a tip for sausage or pepperoni or whatever you want to put on your pizza.
Yes, you should use all the meat. 2, smoked sausages are probably my favorite thing. And, pepperoni being the classic example of this. But there's a world outside of pepperoni. You should try out some other things. Smoked Hungarian sausage, beautiful. So try out some things. Salami's really nice, especially if it's sliced really thinly and it crisps up really nice. It's almost like bacon.
You're killing me over here.
Pancetta,
right.
really nice. You
Right.
gotta pre-cook it. pancetta is beautiful.
So we're having pizza after this, right?
When you're doing this kind of thing, especially with smoked sausages and whatnot, a really good thing to do with them is to try to degrease them. You do this because there's a lot of fat in sausages, and while fat is delicious, what will happen is that if you're cooking it on top of the pizza, what will happen is all the fat will come out of them and then pool on top of the pizza, and you just end up with a greasy pizza. And that's not good eats. What you can do is you can take your sausage, cut it up thinly, take a plate, put some paper towel on it, and then put a single layer of the sausages, another layer of paper towel, and then another plate. So you've got this sort of plate, paper towel, and then sausage sandwich.
That
Microwave.
doesn't sound good at all.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't want you to
this
play.
is just the first step. Microwave it for a minute, minute and a half. Let it sit for a bit. What will happen is some steam will generate inside of between the two plates. The sausages will steam a little bit. That'll melt the fat. It'll leach out onto the paper towel. And now you've got defatted slices of sausage that are still plenty flavorful. Put those on your pizza. They will crisp up nicely and they won't make it greasy. Doesn't take long to do. It's a nice step to do if you got the time.
And then, for the last thing, the most important thing perhaps, cheeses.
Right. So there is a world of cheese outside of mozzarella and cheddar and, those pre-packs.
Monterey Jack. I'm a big fan of Monterey Jack and mozzarella mix on my pizza.
I like to do, in addition to mozzarella, I love feta, or Parmesan cheese is lovely. I think there are a few things in the world better than toasted Parmesan cheese.
I'm a big believer in getting the good cheese from your local cheese shop instead of getting the bargain basement stuff from your supermarket as well. A good cheese really makes all the difference in pizza because pizza is all about the cheese as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to, if you put too much cheese on your pizza, it can in fact swamp it, prevent it from crisping up properly, etc. So a smaller amount of really good quality, really flavorful cheese is a great way to go. Mm-hmm. And you can do layers there. You can take something really flavorful, put it on the bottom layer, and then put something like mozzarella on top, and so you get sort of both of them and you get a contrast. That can be really nice. You could also take your cheese after you shred it, put it in a bowl, put some drops of liquid smoke in there, toss it around. Now you've got a semblance of smoked cheese. It's lovely. You can do the same thing with hot sauce. Nice, something like a nice Chipotle hot sauce. Do the same tossing maneuver. Now you've got a smoked flavor and you've got that sort of nice mild heat.
Also, Colin practices kitchen witchcraft when it comes to putting cheese on the bottom of pizzas.
Right. So this is something I started doing last year sometime. I was like, well, why can't I have cheese on the bottom of the pizza?
Why indeed?
Why not? So what you can do is you can take, always a good tip to build your pizza on parchment paper. I hope that goes without saying, but you should be doing that because otherwise you're not moving your pizza anywhere. So you got your sheet pan, right? You put your parchment on it. You roll out your dough. Then you put cheese on it. Don't put any sauce or anything on it. Just put some cheese on there. Parmesan is a really good place to start, but anything should work. Put another piece of parchment paper on top of that. Then put another sheet pan. Invert the whole thing. So now the cheese is on the bottom of the crust.
I'm not sure that's legal.
It shouldn't be, but technically it still is because of a legal loophole. Now, take off the sheet pan that is now on top. The other piece of parchment paper. Now build your pizza. So you've got this pizza that was now going to be cheese on the bottom and cheese on top. When you bake it off, the cheese that's on the bottom is going to crisp up really nicely, but it won't burn because the bread's there to insulate. It'll be beautiful, trust me.
I think you're an evil genius, and I would like to subscribe to your newsletter.
Well, I wish I had one, but I
Start
will, perhaps I can share more tips here later.
I think that brings us to the end of Breaking Bread. We'll come up with something next week, but if you need to do pizza, try making it home. It's a little bit cheaper and it's a whole lot tastier.
We'd also like to know whatever your pizza making tips are.
Absolutely, or other recipes you have that will feed a horde of hungry gamers.
We definitely have our own ideas here, but we'd love to hear what you think, and maybe we can share some of those ideas later.
Please don't send us pizza. I like pizza, but pizza plus postal service, I'm not sure those things could or should go together.
Maybe you could send us a coupon, though?
Yes, coupons will work.
Yes.
We're never going to get our address.
We could have a post office box.
For pizza?
For pizza coupons.
Specifically for pizza?
For pizza coupons.
But that would be buying pizza. We're making a case for why it's better to make your own.
Maybe somebody needs to send us coupons for, like, Preston's Choice products so that we can go, or like Loblaws or something like that, so we can go buy the stuff.
Nah.
Look, I'm just saying, the only reason to have a podcast is to monetize it, right? We're all in this for the money, aren't we?
We are?
Yes, I'm sure that's what the role-playing industry is all about. Cold, hard cash.
Especially podcasting.
Exactly.
I think we may be sorely disappointed.
Sorely disappointed.
I am pretty sure that all the podcasters I listen to are rich because of podcasting. Pretty sure.
As long as you're asked no follow-up questions.
Yes.
It sounds like we're out of topics for this week. Next time on Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, we're going to talk about campaign creation, those early constructive kind of things that get things going. So until next time, I'm Bill.
I'm Megan.
And I'm Colin.
And this is Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay.
If we mean love, then
Thanks for listening. For more Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, drop by our Facebook page.
Softest pitch to the hardest break of dawn.
We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for stuff you'd like to hear on the show. Email us at shakerpg@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at shakerpg.
With both of my arms. If we mean love.
Music on our show was kindly provided by Little City, a great Canadian band you guys should totally check out. You can buy their album on iTunes or visit them online at littlecityband.com.
In practice, calm and cool through troubled times. If I mean love, then I'll hold you up to the sky.
If you were to send us gifts in the mail, we wouldn't object.
Yes.
Yes. Maybe don't put that part in. Or maybe put that part in.
Well, we can all give them our
What
address.
I'm saying is I'm an alcoholic, but I'm sorry.
What are you, Ryan Macklin now? Come on.
Well, denial is all I have left, Bill. Let me have that, please.